We want to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. Again, my name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writer Center. I'm also a novelist and fiction writer, so that's why I get the pleasure today of speaking to our guest, Mike Fu, about his amazing, amazing novel, Masquerade, just released today, so available now for the first time to all of you as well. Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and if you have an excerpt handy, would you please give us just a brief reading to give our guest a taste of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the hour?
Sure thing. Thank you so much, Zach, and to everyone at the Writers Center for having me. It's an honor to be here with you on my release day. I'm going to read just a page or two from an early chapter in the novel set in Shanghai. It's the protagonist spending time with his artist friend. After lunch, they decide to take the train to check out an exhibit at the Power Station of Art, where Selma hasn't been yet. Meadow marvels at the way Selma moves through Shanghai with an almost preternatural sense of direction, barely needing to consult her phone as they navigate the subway or streets. She simply flows through crosswalks and alleys while remaining detached in some way, as though cushioned by her own pocket of air. The museum is a massive industrial building that once purveyed electricity to the urban environs and now serves as a gathering ground for baby-faced hipsters and ladies of leisure. They wander absent-mindedly through the exhibits, eventually making their way onto an expansive terrace with wooden floors. The sky is a hazy bluish gray that Meadow equates with summertime in China. They walk to the edge of the terrace and take in the gritty view, the few boats drifting lazily down the Huangpu River, lost in their own thoughts under the sun. That night, they land at a tapas restaurant back in the thick of things, in the French concession. The restaurant is tiny, with only 4 tables and a row of stools at the bar, the doleful accordions of Astor Piazzolla as a soundtrack. They sit side by side at the counter and consume plate after plate of Spanish omelet, smoked sausage, grilled eggplant, cheese, and tomato. Selma regales Meadow with more anecdotes about her residency, the extraordinary people and situations she has been encountering at every turn. At times, he gets so engrossed in her stories that he forgets about their surroundings. It could almost be any other night in New York, one more dinner outing to add to all his existing memories of their friendship. They share a conversational ease, an intuitive understanding of each other's rhythms and idiosyncrasies. Meadow feels himself being constituted in her gaze, as though the particles of his existence were being reassembled, his contours made more solid, simply by being in her presence. An aimless post-dinner stroll leads them to a brutalist bar called Sans Soleil. Meadow initially scoffs at the name, but he discovers that there's a literal meaning to it. There are no windows in the room. More bunker than bar, the washed concrete of the interior is lit up in a garish neon pink and sickly green, like some retro-romantic vision of the future. By the cash register, the tangerine globules of a lava lamp wobble and warp in their sparkly liquid. Mariah Carey provides an incongruous soundtrack to the whole affair, grinning about fantasy and rapture, dreaming while awake. Meadow becomes aware of a mild ache in his legs from walking all day. Surprisingly stuffed from tapas and beer, and soon 2 cocktails deep, he starts to space out and stare at his reflection in the mirror that wraps around the length of the bar. They are the only customers in Sans Soleil. Their silhouettes in the mirror are distant and defamiliarized. At a glance, they could be any other couple in Shanghai, siblings or lovers, classmates or coworkers. Selma has one elbow on the counter, chin against her palm, as she gazes at the lava lamp. Before Meadow even realizes it, the whole story of his romantic misadventure with Diego comes pouring out of him, in spite of his trying not to be a maudlin drunk. Or maybe it's just the effect Selma has on him, coaxing him to name the feelings that burble in his core. I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So in your own words, who the heck are you?
Great question. I think about that all the time. I guess I still consider myself to be a relatively recent transplant to Tokyo. I moved here in 2020, so just going on 4 years now. Um, I don't know, a sort of mid-career switch was in the cards for me, so I came out here to pursue a PhD program. I think I have a sort of interesting on and off, again, relationship to academia in general. Besides writing, I do quite a bit of editing work, and I also translate from Chinese to English. So I think my interests are kind of like pretty broad in the realm of the written word. Yeah, something like that, I guess.
I'm going to throw a curveball right away because you mentioned translation. And how does translation like inform your thinking about writing prose in English, original prose in English?
Yeah, I feel like this is the question that has been asked of me before, and I haven't found an elegant way to answer it.
Surprised it. Put you
I
on the spot.
I think no, it's a great one. Thank you for that, Zach. Yeah, I mean, I guess if anything, translation. I translate from Chinese into English and only that direction, right? So I think that if anything, it makes me aware of the sort of what is it, the malleability, excuse me, malleability of the English language. I think is something that's really like spectacular, and it's something that that both I find enjoyable and can be frustrating when doing translation. And I guess when writing, your own prose in English, you have the benefit or advantage of being able to work with a language that's so bendable in that way. And I think yeah, I really enjoy it to that in that sense.
Great. Thank you. So moving on to my actual first question. Since we're here to talk about the craft of writing, I'm very curious about where does thinking about the craft of writing fall into your process? In other words, when are you most aware of the more mechanical parts of the writing process versus when are you more free-flowing, organic, or intuitive when you write?
I think anyone who writes might agree with me, but I feel like I feel the I become hyper aware of it when it's when you get stuck, right? Like I think everybody has writer's block, and I think those are the moments when you start to become very self-conscious about the thing that you're doing, the world that you're trying to construct. The free-flowing state is really fabulous when it happens, but for me, I would say that's like, quite rare. I often, when I can get into a flow, maybe I can write like a paragraph or two and it comes out and feels nice. But yeah, that generally I would say I'm more often than not in that sort of stuck state and trying to get myself over that hurdle.
Great, thank you. So turning to Masquerade in particular, I'm gonna hold it up again just for marketing purposes. Um, I'm interested in sort of the space between elements. In the case of this novel, it's sort of split between the quotidian, the everyday, and more fantastical elements. And the Meadow, your protagonist, is also sort of split between those two places. I'm fascinated by the alchemy that sort of happens in that space between the two. Like I feel like that's where some meaning making and kind of magic happens. So I want to ask a couple questions about that. Is sort of why did you write this story in that place? What drew you to that kind of dynamic in story writing? And then how does the fantastical sort of let you or interpret or reinterpret the everyday, and vice versa? How does the everyday let you sort of view the fantastical?
Right. I think that I guess I'm drawn to the fantastical because I think it feels like a almost primal or childlike impulse in some ways. I think we all grew up reading like, or hearing fairy tales, and we're drawn into narrative worlds that are quite different from our own. And I guess spending time with the fantastical in this sense in literary fiction is also a way of kind of like detaching a little bit from the quotidian and being able to um, I guess, yeah, remember that childlike sensibility and unlock its potential. I feel like there's a lot of room there for play as well. So I think that's really the main reason why I, tend to write in this register, at least, for this novel.
Does it have any effect on like finding things linguistically? I mean, do you feel yourself like, does it, I guess, maybe encourage you to be more flexible or more expansive with the way you're writing language because you suddenly have the fantasticalness of the world? Does it lead to any sort of fantasticalness of prose? Do you push yourself in ways you maybe wouldn't, writing in a more realist sense? Or maybe the question is, how does writing about the fantastical relate to how you write an email, um, a work email or an email to a colleague at the university?
Good question, Zach. I think that I'm not so sure that I'm aware myself of whether writing in this register pushes me to my prose in a certain direction. Although I'm sure it has that effect, and it's just something that's more subconscious. Of course, writing fiction is very different from writing an email, and um, I'd like to think that if anything, uh, trying to describe worlds that are beyond the ordinary, the everyday realm, um, is a sense of, or yeah, it gives you sort of an opportunity to sort of push further or deeper into your own imaginary spaces and force you to kind of have that confrontation with that, subconscious world a bit more. I think in that way, in that sense, hopefully, it's also something that can, yeah, push your craft to new places.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. So I mentioned the fantastical, and we've been talking about it a little bit. And the fantastical is there. It's not so much a genre itself, but there are certain genres maybe contained in what we call the fantastical. And I do want to talk about genre just a little bit. And just first, broadly, what is genre to you? I mean, are there real divides there, or is all that arbitrary? How does genre enter into your mind if you ever think about it at all?
You're right. I think genre is to me like a set of conventions that signals to the reader the type of story that they can expect. But like many things in this world, it is also an arbitrary construct made with maybe due to real sort of pressures or considerations in terms of the literary industry and the way that publishing works in this world. Yeah, I mean, I think it's both real and imagined, if that makes sense. Like I think, yeah, genre sort of gives you a frame and sets you up to understand a novel in a certain way.
I really love that concept of signaling the reader. That I mean, honestly, you know, if you have a couple dragons in the first page, you're signaling to the reader that you're entering into maybe a high fantasy. I'm interested in this case where genre is played with maybe a little bit more than it is firmly established. What kinds of things are you aware of wanting to signal to the reader? Where were you like, I need to give the reader enough of this at some point so that they can make sense of what's going to come?
I think for this novel, I think that I wanted to play with genre and kind of disturb the boundaries between them a bit. I guess I had in mind that I wanted to incorporate different elements of, maybe mystery or fantasy to a lesser extent in this work, and and try to just make it all make sense, cobble it all together, and just present it as is. I guess I didn't really think too much about how, like how much it needed to cohere together. I felt as long as I had the sort of my own framework of this world is solid and my own sort of approach and understanding of what the story is coherent, that hopefully the reader would trust in the narrative voice and allow themselves to just be carried along through it.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I also love the phrase disturb the boundaries. I wrote that down. I wrote it twice because I wrote it once illegibly and then wanted to make sure I could go back and find it later. So it's reinforced in my head. So that's one of I have little phrases from these chats that I've saved, and that's going to go on my saved chat list because I like the concept of disturbing the boundaries of what we know, we think we know about writing. So another craft thing that interested me in this book is there's some really excellent long form scene writing. You had a great scene. You gave us an excerpt of a great scene that was pretty much continuous, but you also don't hesitate to fill us in on backstory or summarize, which leads us to a discussion of exposition. So there's scenic writing and there's expository writing. Scenic writing it could be turned into a movie pretty easily. Expository writing is explaining something, summarizing, giving a lot of details. So and I think and I should say, I want to ask this, but I think your expository writing is really, really strong. Where and just speaking personally, when I try to write it, I always feel like that's much weaker than my scenic writing. So I tend to write really, really scene heavy and try to stay away from exposition more generally. So how do you approach exposition, and what do you think makes it engaging rather than just an info dump of information that the reader needs to know to get to the next point?
Thanks for your kind words, Zach. I think that this is something I struggle with as well, because I find myself oftentimes drawn to exposition a little bit too much so, in the sense that when I write and, if there's a particular scene between characters and I feel like there's something sort of in the background there that hasn't quite made it to the page yet, oftentimes I know that you can signal to the reader what's going on without telling them point blank X, Y, and Z thing. But then, with particular dynamics too, I find myself really uh, desiring to give that exposition. And oftentimes, in the past, I've had drafts of different pieces of writing where I would kind of like go too far in that direction, offer too much exposition or um, start to get very fixated, hung up on the details of this or that thing that happened in the past that informs the way that the present is unfolding. And I think cultivating that balance is so key to making it all work, as you mentioned. I think and this is the kind of thing where in a novel, right, it works so different from the same balance of exposition and scene in a short story where you have to be so much more economical. And I remember my MFA advisor, Mazu telling me years ago that she made an offhand comment during workshop where she said something like, a novel is so much easier than a short story in some ways because you have all that room to kind of, play with, to move through. And you have just that expansiveness. And at the time, I thought like it sounded so inverse to me, like the idea that like writing a novel could be easier in some way than a short story. But I think I really felt that in trying to figure out, through the multiple drafts of this particular novel, find the right balance of things, find the right rhythm, and I think so long as that all coheres in the end, I think it can work out for the reader who's encountering these scenes and these expository passages.
I mean, you can absolutely get away with a little bit in a novel that you can't get away with in a short story. It. I don't think. I mean, there are authors who do it, but I'm certainly not one who could ever edit a novel to the level that I edit a story. I mean, I go through 60 to 100 drafts of a story and don't think twice about it. I would lose my mind if I tried to do that in a novel. I just couldn't do it. It would be too much material to do that too. So yeah, absolutely agree. In the chat, there was a question going back to one of our earlier discussions, and someone was just asking, how is the fantastical different from magic realism? I might have something to say, but Mike, if you had any thoughts on the difference between fantastical and magic realism, because I'm also not an academic, so I don't know if that falls at all within your academic sphere.
I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this realm at all either. But to me, I
Mhm.
guess magical realism is still grounded in sort of like the day to day, right? It's about occurrences in the realist landscape that you wouldn't quite encounter in your ordinary life. So it's about like those elements, again, perturbing the boundaries or unsettling a little bit of the day-to-day world. And I think the fantastical in my mind is something that's a couple of steps farther away from that. It's taking a leap into something that may have very tenuous connections to the real world, whatever the real world is.
I like that one. I almost think of fantastical almost as the catch-all that maybe, magical realism is sort of like the mildest fantastical, if we're going in spice levels, the mildest flavor of fantastical is magic realism. And, by the time you get to fantasy, the entire existence is within the fantastical. But yeah, I like what you said there too. I think that maybe yeah, I mean, man, I don't think I'm not an academic on this either, but yeah, I think about the fantastical a lot. And I have read a little bit on it academically, but it was a long time ago, and my knowledge is lacking. Um, oh yes, so I'm really glad you read the excerpt that you read at the beginning because I love scenes written at bars. I love writing scenes at bars. I think they're such fascinating places to observe and think about, and the way people act there or misbehave there, or the way, yeah, people be like one person will become their truest self there, and one will become some total other thing. Anyway, it's so fascinating to me socially. But there's a school of writing advice that I've heard many times that you should never set a scene in a bar. And I think the thinking is that it's because all anyone can do is have a drink. But I'm like, you're going to the wrong bars because that's never been my experience in any bar I've ever gone to that it was boring. If you just pause and look around for a minute, it is the social, it's, yeah, I don't know, sociology. It's just pure sociology all around you. And I like to look at it. So I find the bar or the club or a party to be a really, really interesting place to write about. And I'm really glad that you're a writer who maybe thinks the same way, at least in this book. So, what interests you in that setting? And is there like a craft lesson to be learned from setting scenes in bars? I maybe hinted a few things there, but yeah, what draws you to that setting? Because it happens a few times. And what maybe does it allow you to do that another setting doesn't grant you?
Um, yeah, I totally agree with you, Zach. I think bars are really interesting places, both in real life and for fiction writing. As you sort of alluded to, I think they're perfect places for people watching, and I think that what interests me about bars is that there's so many different, of course, this is stating the obvious, but there's so many different kinds of bars and so many different atmospheres that they can produce. Um, I think it's a great place to kind of see or get a feel for local culture wherever you are in the world, seeing how people engage with alcohol or don't, and the sort of mood or ambiance that's created in these spaces. Um, yeah, people watching is a prime aspect of it, and but then there are also strange kind of like forlorn moments, like the scene that I just read from, where I think like an empty bar oftentimes is a very lonely place too, and it sort of gives another kind of mood, creates another kind of space that maybe only one person experiences. Maybe it's people sitting in silence. There's a whole range of different social atmospheres that bars provide access to. And then, so long as you can stay sober and watch it from the side, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a few questions coming in the chat window. So I'm going to look over there and go through a few of those because they seem really good. So the first question that came in was, how can you become a fiction writer? I write poetry, but I would like to know if I can write fiction.
I think anyone can write fiction. It's just a matter of discovering your taste in it. I think reading a lot is the advice that's often given, and I tend to agree with that. Like uh, you've, I feel like you have to really read a lot and figure out what speaks to you in fiction, and that will give you sort of a starting point, a place to sort of a sense of how to navigate that terrain, particularly if it's something new to you.
I'm going to add in just one thing, which is read classics, but also read contemporary fiction, because if you only read classics, you're not going to know the current state of fiction. You won't be able to enter into conversation with who would be your peers if you do write fiction. And you could start by getting Masquerade by Mike Fu at your local independent bookseller or online, wherever books are sold. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Um, Another question from the chat. How have your experiences in academia influenced your writing process?
I think academia is such an interesting space because it allows people to really dive deep into the tiniest things, really get fixated and spend oftentimes years on particular project, an article, a research topic or field. I think I like the meticulousness of academia, and I think in my own academic work, it's been, it's quite different, of course, from fiction writing in many ways. But I do appreciate the sort of research elements that are part of writing a scholarly article, and yeah, I think that sort of like degree of meticulousness and sort of like attention to detail is something that I try to bring from my academic work into fiction writing as well.
Great, thank you. Another question from the chat. How did you find a balance on the page between craft and being true to memory, culture, and language? That's a good question, but a hard one.
Yeah, I think memory, culture, and language. Yeah, those are all pretty hefty things, right? um, I would say that like I think for myself, when you get into the nice flow state of writing, hopefully you become less self-aware of what it is that you're doing and you just let it happen. And of course, revision is a whole other huge thing that the writers of all kinds have to contend with. Um, I think I try to let myself, be a little more free flowing to the extent possible, knowing that I'll come back to this and rework this and revise and edit. Um, and that in that moment, craft really is not something that's really high in my mind. I think I'm trying to intuitively let the story take shape and just allow myself to really figure it out as it happens.
How do you, so I'm going to follow up on that. How do you, going back in revision, I think I've read books where I felt like maybe the spirit of the book was revised out, and that's not the case here. And it seems like, how do you, in revision, clean things up mechanically and function on that level, but still maintain the energy and the passion or whatever it was that drove the writing process in draft one?
I think my short answer to this is having great collaborators is really key. And whether that's somebody in a workshop setting that you can share this with, share your writing with, or whether you're working with your agent or editor, I think they're definitely key players in the revision process for a book publication. And as for myself, this novel went through quite a number of intensely different drafts from the time I completed it to the time it went out on submission to publishers, and then even to in the very end, to the final project that you see is really the result of so much care on the part of my editor Elizabeth DeMeo at Tin House and my agent
Elizabeth.
Heather Carr. Yeah, they're both fantastic people to work with, and I think I really I'm so grateful to the sort of time and energy that they put into this project, helping me really polish it up and whip it into shape in many ways.
Yeah. Elizabeth did an event with us for, I forgetting the book right now. It was the Following Thoreau book, and I can't remember the name title of it, but she talked with the author that about that book anyways, and she lives up in Baltimore near us. So that's great. That's exciting. So moving on to a broad question from the chat. What inspires and informs your novel writing?
I guess I am drawn to history in some ways, and I think if you read this novel, it'll become clear that there's this sort of like impulse on my part to get into historical fiction to a degree, but I've also yeah, I've struggled with that as well because writing historical fiction is such an intense and demanding process in terms of, fact checking and research and all those things. So I think the way that it appears in my novel uh, uh, within this frame of a book within a book, it allows me to kind of explore that space without fully, embracing it as historical fiction. Besides that, I think I'm somebody who's definitely really influenced by film in general. I was a former film student, and I think a lot of the way that I think about storytelling tends to be visual, and I guess that's the way it comes out on the page oftentimes. When I think about characters or settings, I really get I feel the sort of like need to describe um, what this what this place looks like, what this person looks like. I feel like I really need to know the layout of a room in order to write about it at all. Things like that. So those are all kind of in the background when I'm working on it.
Oh, that's great. And also the film aspect. I worked in TV for a long time, so also like maybe that's one of the reasons I like this book is that there's some similarity of similar visual thinking and having lived in that space for a while. Next question from the chat is a really cool one, so I'm excited for it. I feel like so much of this is a love letter to cities, among other things. What did you do to ensure each had their own character mood, and how did you decide to set certain events in each?
Oh, thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think I lived in New York for 12 years myself, and this book, I would say 80% or so takes place in New York. So it was definitely an opportunity or a space for me to kind of draw upon my existing memories of the city, but also written during a very strange time. I have to mention that I started writing this basically in March 2020. Um, Not very intentionally, like taking that sort of pandemic moment to start a project or whatever, but rather I had versions of this. I've been iterating something along the lines of this novel for quite a while before that, and just happened to um, really find my momentum as the pandemic was beginning. So a lot of the time that I was spending in the world of the novel was taking place when, you know, the world itself was actually very inaccessible. And during that time too, I moved out of New York, and I got to Tokyo later that year in November. And so a lot of this writing about New York was actually reflecting on this period, on a city that I no longer had access to, and thinking about you know, the different ways it shaped me. Yeah, I'd agree with the comment that it's kind of, you know, a love letter to cities is a good way to put it. Uh, I think that there are, you know, going back to the bar topic from earlier, I think urban places in general are interesting platforms where you can see a convergence of humanity, and see people kind of like behave in all the different in all the different ways that a human can behave. You know, whether it's I feel like there's a range of moods that can be struck in the city in a bar, when you have just the critical mass of people, and people just kind of like riffing off of each other's moods and emotions and all of that. So I think that's kind of like what interests me about cities in general. And in terms of how I sort of like apportioned these different elements between different cities, I guess that wasn't as intentional. And maybe I was trying to follow, or kind of let my characters guide me in their own way through these urban spaces.
Thank you. Going back to the chat window, do you have any, excuse me, do you have any ideas, any advice with plot? This is my biggest challenge. What do you think about plot?
Yeah, I think plot can be tricky, right? I don't have great advice here, unfortunately. I think, you know, for people, some people of like novel length works, I know work pretty rigorously with outlining, and I think that works for if that's the kind of thing that you find helpful. I think, you know, if you outline, you can sketch out something, you can have a general sense of where this dramatic arc is going. I think that feels nice, and I've tried doing that myself before, but I also find that like even if I outline something, I tend to abandon what it is that I've constructed, and ultimately just go by intuition again. Um, yeah, I think to me the sort of most important points, or some of the most critical parts of a novel length plot, are the beginning and end. And I will say that that's something I really struggled with over the different drafts of my novel. Um, I think the sort of core stuff has been pretty consistent through the successive drafts. But while I was working on this with my agent before we went on submission, we went through, I think, four intensely different drafts that had very different opening chapters and scenes, and some of them were later incorporated into the final version. Actually, the scene I read today was originally one opening of this novel. Um, but I think all at the same time, a lot of other stuff had to fall away as well. Yeah, I think finding your entry and exit point from the story is probably the most important in my mind. And maybe sometimes it's a matter of trial and error. And, you know, if you can have like many different versions of this, and then kind of like mix and match and see what works, that might be one possible tactic.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in too that there's lots of like very concrete plot advice. And if you're thinking about that and that's what's causing you the challenge, then I'm just going to say too that there are no rules in creative writing. So there's no rule you have to follow the traditional plot advice. So if you're getting caught up trying to do a nice story arc, try something different. And a lot of time I think about what we refer to as plot is really more just plot is just a way to almost measure forward motion. And there's a lot of ways things can move forward, and that can be plot wise, it can be language, it can be character development. So maybe if plot is challenging, you think about forward motion in these other areas, and plot might be a byproduct of establishing forward motion in other areas, as opposed to the thing that creates the forward motion in those other areas, which I think is how it's often talked about, is that's the thing that drives all forward motion, but it's a thing that can drive forward motion, would be my alternative theory. Back to the chat window. And for those who joined late, I'm losing my voice. I really apologize. I'll try not to clear my throat too many more times without muting. How do you decide what goes into the story and what needs to go?
That's also a great question. I think that there's a lot of stuff that I did cut over the different drafts, and at the same time, I think even if it doesn't appear on the page per se, it still is something that informs you as the writer, your understanding of the story. So in that sense, I don't think of it as a loss. I think it's a matter of melting down, I guess, the story to its most not Spartan necessarily, but I think trying to only retain the things that the story really needs in some sense. And I think at a later point, working with an editor, this is where the sort of like dialogue becomes so important, because Elizabeth and I had a lot of great back and forth on certain areas of the book, and she really helped me distill, I think, much of it, many of the scenes into what they are. And then there are certain areas that were flagged for potential cuts that I also had to argue to keep. And I think in that sense, it was really good to have an opportunity to sort of take a moment and really justify and articulate to both yourself and your editor, and your future reader, why is this scene, why is this chapter important, what's going on here that you know can't be, that would be a loss if we were to remove it entirely. So I feel like having those touch points both internally and then with somebody else, as you're editing, really can help you figure out what needs to stay in a story, what's sort of critical to it, and other parts that are a bit, fluffy, or maybe can be excised without detriment to the story itself.
Thank you. All right. Another question from the chat. I have written 2 books and published none. Can you discuss your process of publishing your first book?
Absolutely happy to share about this. I was also at various points in this process. I was starting to really think about the potential of, maybe I've written this book and it's not going to go anywhere, um, whether in the querying process and finding an agent, or the submission process. I would say publishing, from what little I know of it, is just an insanely difficult landscape. It's like academia. Publishing also is an industry that rejects you all the time, and it's incredibly disheartening. No matter how much you can tell yourself that it's like, of course, everything's so subjective, and it's really a confluence of skill and talent, but also chance and kind of meeting the right people at the right time. Yeah, I think you have to be persistent, I guess, and really find your way to meeting that agent and editor that can really understand who you are and kind of your vision for the work that you're trying to produce. I feel like those are the sort of key partnerships that will help you get your novel into the world. And it's not easy. And I think in the meantime too, having friends and other literary colleagues that you can turn to for advice, or even just venting, I think is really critical and necessary. It's such a challenging landscape, right? So I definitely completely empathize, and have been there in terms of just trying to figure out how to do this thing, or what's my next move if this thing doesn't come together.
Yeah, my first novel never got published, so absolutely just keep writing too. I mean, and publishing might be in its most awful phase ever right now. Hopefully it's the bottom of a valley and it's going to come back up, but it seems really bad. I don't say that to be discouraging. I just say it like if the only thing keeping you writing is the prospect of publishing, try to cultivate something besides that as the ultimate goal. Try to let the writing itself be a goal in some way. And it's not actually a terrible time for publishing short fiction if you're a fiction writer. There's lots and lots of online journals. There's lots and lots of print journals. There's lots of places, lot of outlets for that. But yeah, having people and having goals that aren't necessarily tied to publication is the way to keep from losing your mind in the business. Back to the chat. How did you balance researching your novel and writing the draft, especially during the earlier, more exploratory phase of drafting? I like this question. I like research questions.
Well, I think that let's see. I for the New York portions of the novel, I felt like there was very little research I had to do. More so, spending time mulling over, thinking about the things that I, lived or experienced or thought about, thinking about the experiences of my friends and others in my life over the years. So that was relatively straightforward and kind of, I feel like I just took 12 years of life and put it in a box, shook it all up, and regurgitated it in some way. Um, as for the research portions, set in like the historical portions, right? I'm also somebody. So the novel within a novel in Masquerade takes place in the 1930s in Shanghai, and of course that's a very interesting and very fraught era in Chinese history. Um, I would say the research kind of came a bit later, though, because 1930 Shanghai is also a very common setting for a lot of different films and TV dramas in the Chinese world. And I think it's a sort of era of history that's romanticized in some way, in spite of the sort of intense political upheaval and lots of other problems of the day. There's a certain what is it? A certain cosmopolitan yearning from that time that I think, in retrospect, a lot of storytellers to this day still look to. There's a sense of, I guess, openness or uncertainty about the future, and certainly danger in the everyday. But I think there was also a moment when China as a country was really trying to establish and find its modern identity. So because I'm somebody who was really into film, I had seen so many Chinese films about that era in the past. So I think I started out kind of just riffing on my own memories of different moods and characters and spaces and whatnot. And then I think later on, I found myself in lots of sort of like, particular historical incidents and things like that. But yeah, I think in the beginning, I think I relied more so on intuition, and then later on going back to kind of really make sure, like preening those parts of the novel.
Thank you. You mentioned taking 12 years and sort of shaking up in a box. So the next question from the chat's a good question. How much of this book is fiction? How much nonfiction, or how much is drawing from real life?
Um, I would say it's 100% fiction,
Yeah.
of course, and I think there are elements of it that are inspired by true events. But I mean, I think isn't that the case for any book? I think the interesting thing about being a writer, of course, is that, or I guess this question has come up sort of in casual conversation before, and I don't know, when I think about a novel, it the whole novel is the writer in some way. I mean, it is the writer, the work of the writer and the editor, of course, and all the others that are part of the sausage making process of book publishing. But Yeah, I think I don't know. It's a funny question. I think the whole thing is me, and the whole thing isn't me. In that sense, fiction is just kind of a space where you get to construct your whole world. It's a whole universe that belongs to one person only, and then you share it with others, and they have their own sort of perspectives on it and entry points into it. It's a really kind of fantastical thing in some ways.
So one of the most common and most probably discussed pieces of craft advice is write what you know. And I feel like it's related to this a little bit. How would you view write what you know as an axiom of creative writing in view of how you think about yourself within your work?
I think writing what you know is a great place to start. I think it's hopefully familiar and comforting in a way, and I think you might be able to sort of intuitively um, do a lot on the page writing what you know. And then I also think it's good to kind of like push beyond that from time to time as well. I think getting outside of that comfort zone too is critical and important for any writer's growth.
Yeah, thank you. Back to the chat. What is your process for drafting your writing? Do you write every day?
I definitely do not write every day, or at least I haven't been. Although I will say that, so I think in general, I've been writing for, I don't know, let's say, yeah, for a long time, 10, 12 years. I've always thought of myself as a writer, but I think that this is the first novel manuscript that I was able to complete. And I recognized at some point very early on, I realized that I am a person who loves to generate ideas, and then I also am someone who's very bad about follow through. So I realized that in the past I'd sort of written chunks of what I wanted to be a novel, but I would kind of give up after 50 pages or 100 pages even. And I recognized that okay, like, if this is the way it's been with me, I realized I had to sit myself down and make sure that I just got the full thing done, whatever it looked like, however it felt. And and I guess, the pandemic was a help in this sense because there were very few distractions, right? I mean, of course, we did move from the US to Japan during that time, but I'm talking about kind of like day-to-day life. It wasn't easy for me to go I couldn't just like leave the house and do whatever. And I think that as I was settling into Tokyo in late 2020, early 2021, and I was working on this novel, at a certain point, I started to notice that I was maybe going to lose steam on this as well, and made an effort to kind of just sit down and write every day at that time, and work on this just a little bit for an hour or two, nothing spectacular. But I think that really helped in terms of just like giving me the space to get out. Like sometimes it would be up to a page. Usually it was more so like a paragraph or so. And I think that accumulation over time was really what got me past the finish line. Um, I'm forgetting the first part of the question actually, but that's that. Yeah.
No, I think that was it. Yeah, thank you. Um, so uh, I was interested about your literary influences. I'm interested in like just what has influenced you as a writer, but also, at least for me, when I write a book, I feel like that book is sort of in conversation with specific other books. So I'm wondering if that's the case for you, if there's other books that you're writing maybe is in conversation with other books or other authors.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many Asian American authors these days whose works I've really enjoyed. I just read Sea Change by Gina Chung earlier this year, and I thought that was a really funny novel and interesting, felt connected to in many ways. And of course, there's the work of my good friend Julie Min, who's the author of Shanghai Landers. I think there's so many voices that diasporic writers are offering nowadays, and I feel like that's really something that I hold dear to my heart. In terms of like other influences, I I feel that I don't know. This is a question that's come up, and I guess I am remembering that when I was younger, I had like lots of I read a lot of genre, a lot of like fantasy and things that might not be apparent, I think, looking at the kind of novel that I've produced. But this kind of gets back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, but realizing that, when I was a teenager or younger than that, I was really drawn to the sort of intensive world building of high fantasy and also some other maybe like strange, surreal, kind of like gothic horror writing. I'm thinking about this author named John Bellairs, um, whose work I really, really loved when I was younger. Um, yeah, I often, I mean, I think as a writer and kind of like reflecting on your own literary upbringing is like an important thing to do from time to time. I think I feel like for myself, I'd forgotten a lot of kind of like what drew me to reading in the first place. And then only in recent years, kind of like, reminiscing a little bit about the type of things I was reading as a child and as a teenager. I feel like that really kind of unlocked a lot of memories for me and sort of made me understand something more about like why it is I'm doing this thing that I'm doing, or like what it is that draws me to the written word in general.
Thank you. Um, so earlier on, I mentioned flashbacks and backstory in terms of exposition. Here, though, I'm just sort of interested in, you know, sometimes there's conventional wisdom that you don't want to do a flashback. You don't want to include backstory. It's obviously defied brilliantly by many, many authors, including you. So I really wanted to bring it up here because what I don't want to say justifies, because that is assuming that it needs to be justified, but what makes a flashback or a bit of backstory effective? When does it enhance a novel, and what gives it that enhancing ability?
I'm not sure if I can answer the question of what and how a flashback enhances. More so, it's like I feel like even when you want a narrative to be kind of fully set in the present, it's kind of impossible, right? If you think about just the way that we experience our daily lives, like we're never living just only in the present moment as much as we want to be mindful and attentive to kind of our surroundings. We're constantly, kind of negotiating that sort of interior world, that internal monologue, or um, being on the street, even with no distractions, not listening to music and whatnot, we'll encounter something that makes us think about a person that we know, or a flicker of a memory. And I think that that's very much a part of the way that we live in the world. And that's part of the human experience. So, in that sense, I think like having a flashback or having a moment where you're recalling something that happened earlier feels to me just like quite natural, and that it's just a part of the way that we understand, yeah, our place.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, well, we're right about at the end of, we have one question from the chat. I'm going to throw this in real quick before we get to the last question. Do you think there's a narrative difference between Chinese novels and novels of the European tradition?
Oh, that's a that's a big question. Short answer, yes. I'm not a person who is an expert in this realm, but I think that it depends on kind of what era of writing you're talking about. But I definitely encourage you to check out, the sort of what's called the four classics of Chinese literature. There's some, they're pretty much all available in English translation. I think. Yeah, I think there's a lot of modern Chinese writing too. That's quite interesting. A lot of translators doing amazing work out there, including Jeremy Tiang, who is, a friend and colleague, very prolific translator who's done a lot of amazing work from the Chinese speaking world. So definitely encourage you to check out what he's been translating.
Thank you. And we are at the end, so I'm going to move to our final question, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
I think read a lot, find your community, and keep your chin up are the things that come to mind immediately.
I love that. I think it's a great place to conclude. Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, please get a copy of Masquerade. It's an amazing, amazing novel. You're going to love it. It's available from your local independent bookseller. It's available from the bookshop.org link we just put in the chat window or anywhere books are sold. I want to thank you all for coming out. I'd like to thank my voice for not quite giving out before the end of this. I will not be able to speak tomorrow, but it was worth it. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. Thanks for getting up early in the morning in Tokyo and giving us a well, not quite bedtime chat, but evening chat here back in the States. So thank you so much, and best of luck with your brand new book.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you for hosting me and appreciate all the questions from everybody. Thanks for making time to hang out on Zoom with me today.